What's up, everybody? Today we will be investigating the 1971 Supreme Court case, New York Times versus U.S., specifically addressing the arguments between it, the court's decision, and its effect on society. Just to give us some background info on the topic, we have Ms. Casey Lamb here to help us out. So tell me, Ms. Casey, what's some details that we should know beforehand?
Ring. Oh, hey Zoe. Oh, you want to know about the New York Times versus the U.S.? So it started with Daniel Enberg, a former worker in the Pentagon's International Security Affairs, ISA. He managed to lay his hands on the Pentagon Papers, which discussed the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. He illegally printed copies of it, feeling that the U.S. government was being deceitful to the American people. Nixon claimed that everything was alright and that the war was in good shape, when in actuality, he was pursuing his own policies around Vietnam and costing thousands of lives. People were already hysterical over the war because it was an undeclared war that was motivated not by an attack, but rather a desire to contain communism.
Wow, so he was essentially lying to the American people.
Yeah, straight up lying. And the reason for being in the war was very looked down upon.
I can see why. Well, thank you so much for explaining the background details of the case.
Yes, of course, you're very welcome.
I'm going to call an interview B now to discuss the arguments of the case. What happened when Ellsberg got illegal copies of it? How did it end up in the New York Times paper? And what did the Nixon administration do and feel towards all of this? I'll let B take it away.
Zoe. So, Ellsberg showed the study to New York Times reporter Neil Sheenan. From there, Sheenan and colleagues sorted through thousands of papers and decided to risk publishing highly classified material. They used some of the information in the Pentagon Papers in order to create headlines and describe the shocking information they found. Nixon's administration reacted nervously to the papers, fearing its effect on his reputation, and issued federal injunctions against any further publication of the Pentagon Papers via prior restraint.
Can you explain this idea of prior restraint, please?
Yeah, so the idea of prior restraint is essentially censorship that allows the government to prevent publication of printed material. So the New York Times argued that this was a violation of their First Amendment right, specifically the right to publish public information, thoughts, and opinions without restraint of censorship, aka their right to press.
I see. So now that we have the arguments of each side established, we'll talk to Jocelyn about the court's verdict.
Hey Zoe, so in a 6-3 ruling, the court decided that the prior restraint violated the New York Times First Amendment to freedom of press. The court ordered an immediate end to the injunctions against publication. This decision ultimately made it very difficult for government censorship to restrain free speech and the press.
This continues to affect society today because trials involving government censorship will most likely be deemed unconstitutional, unless it's a critical threat to national security, such as specifying the exact time and location of the D-Day invasion. People have the right to publish what they want. In Nixon's case, it wasn't actually a threat of national security, but more of a threat of his reputation. I can definitely see these issues arising again in the future, considering how much ease and accessibility we have to technology, resources, and information these days. How do you think society would be affected if the court overturned their decision?
Sheesh, that's a serious question. I haven't really thought that far, but I believe a lot of vital information would be kept a secret and society could be misguided. I also feel like people might feel very oppressed and limited by the government because of the lack of freedom they would have to express or share thoughts and information.
Right. That reminds me of a similar case to New York Times versus U.S. when a contractor who worked for the National Security Agency, Edward Snowden, revealed thousands of classified documents to journalists in 2013 as he felt his work for the government violated American citizens' privacy. Had he not been allowed to publish the information he felt guilty against, he'd probably feel a heaviness in his heart knowing information was being guarded despite its possible help to others.
Yeah, there's a whole ethical and moral side to it.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Jocelyn, for sharing. I hope to hear again from you in the future. Beep. Well, that sums it up, everybody. U.S. versus New York Times was a debate between prior restraint and freedom of press, and when, if at any time, prior restraint is justified. Unless evidently a threat to U.S. national security, our constitutional right, listed by the First Amendment, grants us the ability to share information and opinions freely. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Consider a case you feel is important. How do you think society would function if the court overturned its current decision? I urge you to think. Bye!
Yes, you're welcome. Yes, of course, you're very welcome.
Yeah. Oh, no, I don't like yeah.
I would also like to give a huge shout out to the guy behind me. Thank you so much.
Ra 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 ah. Rama. Ooh la la. I'm an astronaut.